what I've tried to put on this slide is to think about what actually is included in society and change. So we've got the obvious ones. We've got the bottom left picture. I've tried to express that's women, if you haven't guessed. Class is a really hard thing to express in a picture. So the middle one is class. The one on the right is about race and immigration. So when we break down society, we're thinking of those three areas. But if we want to target the top levels, we need to also think about those three concepts at a slightly deeper level. So if we take women, for example, and this is building on what we've been talking about the last few weeks, when we think about women, you also then, women are just not one homogenous group who have exactly the same experience. We have to think about women in terms of also their class as well. Because actually the experience of women in 20th century Britain is going to be very different for middle class women as opposed to working class women, and the right to vote is a really good example of that. And we'll come on to that in a moment. Also, when we think about class, obviously we're breaking it down upper, middle, working class. But even within that, that's not straightforward as well. Upper class, fair enough. Middle class, that's normally quite straightforward. The working class, though, is slightly trickier because, again, you can't necessarily think of working class as being one homogenous group with a shared experience. If we went back into the 19th century, they divided class, and we can divide class again into what we refer to as the artisan or the artisan working class, skilled working class, so those with a trade, and the unskilled working class, who would normally be they sometimes referred to as the labouring poor. So people within the skilled working class probably would have had more in common with those in the middle class than they would necessarily with the unskilled working class. Finally, with race and immigration, again, we can subdivide that because when we talked about immigration, we talked about different waves of immigration, but you've also got immigration from different parts of what was the British Empire. So we've got New Commonwealth migrants, you've got those coming from Caribbean countries, and then you have migrants, the later wave, coming from Southeast Asia. So we just need to bear in mind that we don't just lump them all together. We try, I seem to be using this word quite a lot, nuance. We need to keep coming back to how can I show nuance to really show my understanding. So this is very similar to what we looked at last lesson or last subject support. Thinking about, well, how can we revise this? Because a lot of students, there's loads of legislation. How do I learn this legislation? And the best way to learn legislation is to understand why it's happening. So to put it into a bigger narrative, but also to try and see patterns and try and make links between bits of immigration, bits of legislation. So in terms of this chart, I've kind of picked out the really cool ones. You could subdivide it into women, race and immigration, and class. Let's deal with that middle question. Just have a look through these bits of legislation. Because also when we think about changes into society, it's not happening in a linear upward fashion. The rate of change varies a lot across the 20th century. So I'm just going to give you a minute to think about this. What would you say about change over time if you just had this in front of you? Okay, right, Holly, what do you think about the pace of change over time?
It looks like after the war, there's more like change in legislation rather than interwar.
Yeah, definitely. And that's clearly, you know, look at the pieces of legislation that are happening. If we look at 1918 to 1945, there's really not very much at all. So the pace of change is massively speeding up if we go to the post-war era, and we're going to kind of talk about that in a moment. Let's just take a step back. Are there any that you're kind of like, I've no idea what that's about? You can have a think about that. Let's just take women then. If we were going to just look at the pieces of legislation that are affecting women, which ones would you pick out? Letitia, do you want to start us off?
The Abortion Act.
Okay, right, definitely the Abortion Act. Jack, another one?
Matrimonial Causes Act.
Absolutely, yeah. Who else have we got? Lily, I think you might be there. If you can't unmute, put it in the chat. Another one.
Contraceptive pill.
Yeah, the contraceptive pill. Good. Let's think of that anymore. Equal Pay Act is one also that is relevant to women. I think we have covered most of them. There's one more we definitely need to mention. I think we mentioned the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, but there's another one. There's another one that's really vital to changes for women in the 20th century. Anyone, unmute. Give me an idea what you think it is.
Matrimonial Causes Act.
It's definitely one that is relevant to women. I want you to go back a bit earlier in time. Something is happening to women that's allowing for all of these pieces of legislation.
Is it Representation of the People's Act?
It is indeed. And we're going to actually keep coming back to that, because when I was thinking this through, I was thinking, well, you know, why is this change happening? And a lot of the legislation that's relevant for women can only happen once they have got political representation. And actually, although they've got the vote, if we think back to when we did theme 1, although they've got the vote, they have very little representation in Parliament. That starts to change in the post-war era. So going back to Holly's point, well, you know, the pace of change starts to increase in the post-Second World War era. That could be a clue why, is because women are getting better represented actually in Parliament, which allows them to push for these types of legislation. Family Allowance Act is a really good example of that. Is Barbara Castle? Really pushes that it has to go to the female, it has to go to the mother rather than the father. Let's click on. In fact, before we do that, so we've got how these 3 groups are changing. So how society is changing for these 3 groups. If we looked at this legislation, are there any other suggestions about how society is changing? You know, that you can't necessarily pin on one group. I'm thinking particularly about the Theatres Act, the Obscene Publications Act, the Abortion Act, Sexual Offences Act. What was going on in the late 50s and the 60s to society? Letitia, any suggestions?
They get a bit more kind of liberal. I don't really know the word to use, but they're willing to do things which aren't very conservative.
Okay, you've got the most important point, the word there, liberal, the growth of the liberal society. So it's not just that it's changing for 3 groups, there are some processes that are happening to the whole of society in its entirety. Right, let's click on. So the other aspect to think about is, yeah, this is what happens to these three groups, but let's think about why it's happening. What is causing change in society? And actually, going back to Holly's point again, look at how many of these are relevant to the post-war era. So how do we explain this rapid change in society after 1944? Well, or 1945, sorry. We've got growth of baby boomers. We've got the availability of consumer credit, rise of television, development of the welfare state. You've got more acts of parliament. You've got the sex scandals. You've also got some role of individuals. So virtually all of these catalysts for change in society can be pinpointed to the post-1945 era. So let's just think also, which groups did they affect? Again, we'll take women as an example. No, let's take class. We'll do a different one. When we think about class and how what's happening with class, let's think about why it's happening, why class is breaking down, because that's the big process that's happening post-1945. Can we identify some of the causations of this? Which ones would you pick out are relevant? Why is class breaking down? In fact, you can put that in the chat. Okay, I've got my first one. Well done, Jack. Right, Jack, you can take that one then. Development of the welfare state. How is that breaking down class? You have to unmute, I think, first.
It sort of equalises opportunity. So because everyone's got the same access to healthcare and things like that, it means that they're not as naturally disadvantaged as they were, say, before the war. Brilliant. Yeah, we get a levelling up, isn't it? Yeah. So your access to welfare is no longer defined by your class. Excellent. What else is causing changes to class? Lily, can you suggest another one?
It might be a bit far-fetched, but I was going to say sex scandals, because it put sort of those higher up politicians on sort of a more down-to-earth level. Yeah, so if you think of that, that's two really good contrasts, isn't it? We get the levelling up process because of the development of the welfare state, and then we get the bringing down process because those in the upper class, we get the decline of deference because they're associated with the sex scandals, and their hypocrisy is kind of exposed by things like the Profumo affair. So two really good examples there. I think there are at least two more that are relevant to the breakdown of class. Holly, can you see another one?
Could you say maybe rise of TV? Because if there's like mass production, they become cheaper for the lower classes, and then they can it's sort of like a form of escapism, or like aspiration to move up. Yeah, I definitely would pick out the rise of television. You've kind of almost there in your kind of explanation linked it with the one next to it, the availability of consumer credit. So because we have consumer credit, TV is available to all. I think the other thing I would just say with the reasoning why it's having an impact of class, I think another aspect to bring out is that you start to see different cultures. Culture is no longer dominated by the upper class.
television is again a leveler for class, because you get the appreciation of working class culture through television, and with the rise of Coronation Street, for example. But that, and also film as well, it just alters culture, so it's accessible to all, and it's not, your class is no longer defined by what culture you can access anymore. The other one I haven't put on there, actually, which I was just thinking about, which was rather remiss of me. What causes change in society? Does anyone actually want to have a guess which one I have very obviously missed out? And I'll give you a clue. It's linked to development of the welfare state and baby boomers. Anyone got any suggestions?
Is it education?
Well, we could, yeah, I mean, you could perhaps put education as a kind of sub point of development of the welfare state. But why do we get development of welfare state, and why do we get changes to education? If we kind of pinpointed the date around 1944 for the Butler Education Act and comprehensive welfare state from like 1945 onwards, why are they happening then? And why do we have a baby boom in the 1950s?
Is it the war?
It is the war, yes. And I think that's absolutely integral to what's causing change in society. It's a massive catalyst to changes, particularly the Second World War, because everyone is required to participate in the World War. So again, we get to this idea of it being a leveler in society. Right, so has anyone got any questions about this? I'm just kind of trying to give you different ways to think about society, because it's not just about the legislation, it's also about thinking about why it's happening, when it's happening, who it impacts, and those kind of issues as well. What we will do, we'll just end on, if you had to pick which is the most important change, so of those of on our spoke, which is the most important for causing change, which one would you pick out? Letitia, which one would you pick out?
I'm actually quite tempted to go for political power.
I'm glad you're tempted by that, but why?
Well, if you have like a long period of Conservative government, they're going to be less likely to change society. You need political parties to have, well, yeah, to create the change. If I've got a certain type, then change won't get made.
Yes, definitely. And also you need those groups in society. You know, if you think about, you know, the working class as a group got political power from 1918. They're not going to be pushing for things like the development of a welfare state until they've got that political power. And if we think about, you know, the role of women, they're not going to be able to get legislation that's going to improve their status in society without that political power. Once they've got that political power, it forces change with the Labour Party and also forces change with the Conservatives. They've now got to pass legislation which is perhaps going to support and do that levelling up process that we've already talked about, which is leading to like these acts of Parliament which we've also got on the spokes of the wheel.